And now we have a story about football and racism, about succeeding as a black man in the 1960s, about segregation and civil rights. It all went down here at MSU. I sat down on the phone with Maya Washington, the daughter of Gene Washington and a filmmaker. She made a documentary about her dad and the legendary football team that he was a part of. Here's my story about Through the Banks of the Red Cedar. Enjoy.
This was a rebuilding year for Michigan State. His coach, Duffy Doherty, talks to an assistant, John McVeigh.
It was something I discovered later on. I didn't grow up in a household where my dad, said, "Hey, Maya, come on, it's time to watch football." And it never occurred to me to say, "Dad, I want to watch football with you."
This one is sophomore Gene Washington, good for 24 yards.
That's Maya Washington, daughter of MSU football star Gene Washington. Gene went on to play for the Vikings and Broncos.
Washington makes the catch while in the arms of a tackler.
As a child, Maya had little knowledge of her father's football career, and instead viewed him as a champion of diversity because of his work connecting college students to job opportunities. It all changed at a memorial for Bubba Smith, who played a huge role in getting Gene onto MSU's football team.
I didn't realize that Bubba Smith had played such a significant role in my dad's opportunity to get to Michigan State, and I was so moved by that. I wanted to learn more about the Smith family, which led me to want to learn more about Duffy Doherty and this really unique history where Duffy was recruiting black players from the South at a time when no other northern schools were doing it at that incredible pace. And of course, no southern schools would take African-American players at the time.
Michigan State also had somewhat of a football oddity. Hawaii's Dick Kenny kicks the ball barefooted. Shoeless, he faces the kicking tee, joins the huddle, and then...
Maya is also a filmmaker, and she decided to take what she learned about her father, his teammates, and their coach, and turn it into a documentary called Through the Banks of the Red Cedar. At first, her father was hesitant.
Well, I think it's one of those things where, he had to sort of warm up to the idea. I think initially he was very skeptical and reserved, has always supported and encouraged me as an artist. So I think he believed in me from the beginning, but was always very humble in understanding that football is very much a team-oriented sport, and is very proud to have been a part of a great team and had the opportunity to make a contribution to that team.
It's not surprising that he had some reservations about being the star of this movie because, I looked up this football team online and I don't know anything about football, but from what I read, they were incredible. They've gone down in history as one of the best MSU football teams ever.
As Michigan State approaches the start of the 1965 season, head coach Duffy Doherty is confident the green and white will be improved over a sixth-place finish of last year.
We are rather cautiously, or should we say hopefully, optimistic. We realize we have a lot of...
So the story is bigger than Gene. It's bigger than the excellent football team he played on, and it's bigger than football itself. This story is about America. It's about a specific moment in America's history, one that's really not that far off. This was about 50 years ago. Gene is still alive. That's why this documentary is important, and its lessons are still relevant, because they still need to be learned. To get the full picture, we need to go back to the beginning, to the 1960s.
Michigan State had an inauspicious...
Well, to paint the picture, my dad grew up in the segregated South in the 50s and 60s. He attended George Washington Carver High School in Baytown, Texas, which was a few miles away from his hometown of LaPorte, Texas. So my dad actually lived walking distance to the high school in his community, but because of segregation, he couldn't go to the school in his own community because it was a white school, and if you were African American, you couldn't attend the white school in his community. So he was bused to Baytown, to George Washington Carver, and that's where he met my mom. They were high school sweethearts, and they went to an all-black school in their community. And so at that time in the 60s for my parents, things that we take for granted today, like being able to use a public restroom, being able to walk into the front door of a store or a restaurant or a hotel, or to even walk into an establishment that was a whites-only establishment was pretty much impossible. road trips, interstate. You can't just stop at a gas station to use the restroom. It was very dangerous for African Americans to travel during that time because if you were met with people who had ill will towards you because of the color of your skin, it was very unlikely that you'd seek or be able to seek any justice if someone perpetrated violence against you or your family.
Okay, hold it down, please. All of you hear me? You are in violation of Section 1159 Dallas City Code, demonstrating and parading without a permit. Also violating a traffic judge injunction against parading.
It was against this backdrop that Gene met Bubba Smith and his father. Even though Gene and Bubba played against each other, were from different schools, Bubba's father took it upon himself to recommend Gene directly to Coach Doherty, and it worked.
If Coach Smith said my dad was worth taking a look at, Duffy Doherty took that to heart, and that's sort of how my dad made it to Michigan State. But in general, in the country, African Americans could not attend public colleges and universities, and also could not play sports. And in a public school, they were really restricted to historically black colleges and institutions to gain higher education, to participate in collegiate athletics, and those teams and leagues only played other black schools. So what Duffy Doherty was doing was pretty remarkable at a time where it definitely wasn't socially acceptable to have integration on the scale that John Hanna and Duffy Doherty really sort of championed. But the opportunities were very, very limited for African Americans in the South at the time to go to a major institution and sort of be on a path to a great education, but also be in a position to really get some attention from the professional leagues.
Gene and Bubba weren't the only ones recruited from the South by Duffy Doherty. In total, he recruited 23 young black men, and that decision ended up changing football history.
By the time my dad got to Michigan State, for the most part, the media really embraced them. The local sports media just loved Bubba Smith. The phrase "kill Bubba kill" became notorious and synonymous with his name, and all of the students and staff and everybody was really on board and very excited about this team. And I would argue because they were winning and they were really successful, possibly one of the best college defenses of college football history, at least one of the best recruiting classes in college football history in terms of what they accomplished.
And multiple black players from this team went on to have professional careers.
Bubba Smith was the number one pick, an African American. Number two was Clinton Jones, also from Michigan State. Number 5, George Webster, and then my dad was the number 8 pick. And so to have 4 African Americans from the same school at the same time, something that had never happened in history, something that hasn't happened since then, was pretty significant. But it's really interesting. In my research, I didn't find a lot that sort of focused on this being a racial milestone.
The reason for that is the attitude of the era. It wasn't declared a major victory for civil rights because that simply wasn't something that the media would do at that time, which is a shame. But that doesn't change the fact that this team, their bravery and their success, had an effect on black folks around the nation who watched them flourish on TV.
So I definitely feel like culturally today our media is a little more comfortable talking about race, pointing it out, putting it in the headlines in a way that in the 60s and 70s you weren't seeing that so much. However, for the people most impacted by discrimination, they were still feeling race on a day-to-day level. Their experience of race was quite palpable for them. It just wasn't something talked about in the media the way that we are openly discussing it now.
Just because the media chose to focus on their successes and not the realities of racism and segregation doesn't mean that these things weren't on the minds of the people actually playing football. For these players, there was immense pressure to succeed in school, to win every game, to be perfect, or else they'd be sent back to the South.
I think that's part of the reason I maybe didn't know that my dad had such an important role in history, because I was always really passionate about the civil rights movement and did theater plays about the Freedom Riders and Martin Luther King's death, and those are the things I was always really drawn to. And I'd ask my parents, well, what were you doing in the 60s? And they'd say, we were in school. And I was always so disappointed. I'm like, why weren't you out in some streets marching somewhere? And my dad's like, I had a track meet, or I had to, or I had to do this or that, to survive. And I think there are so many people who had a hand in advancing our culture in big ways and small ways. And there are a lot of people who were the first in their community to do something that African Americans had been previously excluded from. And I think that's really the great discovery out of this journey for me.
The making of this documentary, the journey Maya took with her father, helped her learn more about him and about football in general. And now that the film is finished, the public has a chance to take this journey too. So far, the reaction to it has been
so incredibly positive, and we've had an opportunity to screen in the Midwest and the South, and really seeing how much people, whether they are Michigan State alums or Michigan State fans, or just people from the communities that we visited, everyone really has embraced the story and been kind of flabbergasted that this was information they didn't know, details about the desegregation of college football that they're just sort of hearing for the first time.
Not knowing can be dangerous. It's cliche to say that history repeats itself, but here we are. It's 50 years later, and the president himself is embroiled in racially charged conflict with black professional athletes. Oppression is abundant, and the white supremacist system is getting bolder by the day. That's why historical documents, especially those like Through the Banks of the Red Cedar, the kind that tell untold stories, are so important.
Well, I think our story is relevant in 2018 because in order to face the challenges of 2018 and sort of our current political climate and the sort of public and national conversation about race and sports that we're attempting in the media, and people are attempting at the water cooler and attempting to have these conversations at the dinner table. It's so critical that we know our history as Americans, that we know what first contact with the indigenous people of North America was, and what the impact of that was on future generations. In addition to the enslavement of Africans, there's so much that we didn't learn in school that a lot of people are now shocked that they're hearing about things for the first time, and having these conversations, not knowing, well, I didn't know this happened, or I didn't know that happened. And so we have a collective responsibility to make sure that we know our history and that we can all have these really challenging conversations, but at least be on the same page.
Hello, I'm your host, Cole Tunningly, and you're tuned in to The Undercurrent. That was a story about the documentary Through the Banks of the Red Cedar. If that interested you, you can actually see the film on campus this week, next Wednesday in Wells Hall.